Hello, art historians, and welcome to our second part of Romanticism, which I'm entitling Revivals and Reels, or Revivalism and Photography Reels, because there is much more to the Romanticist movement than just the painting that we have looked at. So we're going to dive into that now. So one thing that it's important to remember, and a good way to remember this is to put the R's together, is Romantics were revivalists. And what they like to do is bring things back from the past that weren't necessarily Greek and Roman. So to them, bringing stuff back from the past means something a little bit different. What they wanted to kind of go back to is what they considered to be a simpler time, a time more of emotion, or at least what they thought it was. Like in their mind, medieval Europe being, or Gothic Europe being a time of ladies and lords and a just much simpler time that didn't have so much war or destruction of nature through industry in it. Of course, they were wrong. There were plenty of wars going on earlier. But what the Romantics were looking for was this revival of the past and the good old days, as far as they considered it. And neoclassical had brought back Greek and Rome, but Romanticists wanted to bring something back that was kind of like the sublime, that could create awe, but almost a little bit of fear or terror at the same time. So this time in the 1800s is all about the Industrial Revolution, revolutions in countries, changes in governments. And the Romanticists were like, this is so chaotic, it's so tough. Can we just look back to the past, to the good old days? And one of these things that they looked at was really anything that wasn't Greek and Rome. So Romanticists liked the revival of Egypt, which was kind of awe and mysterious. Plus, Napoleon had discovered the Rosetta Stone in the 1800s whenever he was in Egypt fighting, or actually probably closer to the 1790s. And they had decoded hieroglyphics, and suddenly people were going Egyptian crazy because of that. They liked the Islamic, the Gothic especially. They considered that to be some of the glory days of England. So Romanticists, remember that R. They're about the revivals of bringing back those ancient styles. So we can actually see this, that it's going to make its way to the United States too, because we know Romanticism got here. We saw that with the Hudson River School and the Oxbow. But we see a lot of, within Washington, our nation's capital, we also see a lot of Egyptian. So for example, this is an obelisk, which was very, very popular in Egypt. They usually would have two of them. And the idea being that that point at the top would pierce the sky and bring down the sun's rays of Ra. But there was this revival and this attempt to show that our country was not based on religion, Christian religion. So we had a lot of symbols that had things to do with what we would call pagan cultures, like Greece and Rome, and including Egypt. So for example, the Washington Monument is an Egyptian obelisk, which was very, very popular after Napoleon discovered the Rosetta Stone. So these are actually going to become extremely popular in cemeteries as well, because all this land within cities is going to get bought up, including cemetery land behind churches. So cemeteries actually got moved outside of city limits, where that way they could have their own space and actually kind of be America's first parks, because all the industrial space was taking up all the parkland. And we can see in cemeteries that are from the 1800s a whole lot of obelisks within them, because that was kind of this view of the Egyptian view of death that was much more positive and just a continuation of life. So we'll also see a ton of Gothic revival going on during the Romanticist time. They really thought that neoclassicism was too boring and too rational and too balanced, whereas Gothic was more emotional and beautiful and a little bit scary and awe-inspiring, so that's sublime. And because actually the ironic part is, even though they were looking to the good old days, because of the Industrial Revolution, they had way more materials that they could actually build up with and do things with architecture that they had never done before. So for example, you could have a building with like an iron skeleton, and then that would support itself, so you could really be elaborate and decorative on the outside. So for example, the Chicago Tribune building is a really good example of that Gothic revival. You can see the pointy spires and the perpendicular lines up there at the top. So let's add this into England because this is kind of important. So I showed you in the Romanticist lecture, I showed you works by J.M.W. Turner, and one of the first ones I showed you is whenever he ran to watch Parliament burning, and he actually painted that. Well, when Parliament burned, they needed a new government building. So Britain launched a competition for people to submit ideas for what the new Parliament building would look like. And there were some rules. It had to be in the Gothic style. It had to match this Gothic cathedral that they have in England called Westminster Abbey. And it had to be perpendicular Gothic, which emphasizes the up and down lines, not necessarily flamboyant Gothic that has all these like different curvy lines through it. And it had to be Gothic or from Elizabethan times, because Elizabeth actually helped to revive Westminster Abbey. So they had all these people submit things, and one huge rule was no Greek or Roman reference into it. And the reason for that is because America was using Greece and Rome for everything, and they were still a little bit salty about the fact that we had broken away from them. So if America is going to use neoclassical, England is not. They're going to do something different. They're going to look back to something older that England had as part of their tradition. So this is Westminster Abbey right here. You can see the Gothic spires at the top. You can see the two westworks, the two towers on the outside, and then the verticality of the perpendicular lines. So Barry and Pugin, who are the two architects who won this contest, they decided they were going to use basically modern architecture with all the new iron and steel that they had to create on the outside a Gothic exterior to it. And you can see looking here that it's got very much this Gothic appearance to it on the outside. And this is the Houses of Parliament. This is where the House of Lords and House of Commons meet, very similar to our congressional building in the United States. And you can actually see Westminster Abbey there in the distance behind it, to the right. So this is just another view of it you can see here. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit. All right, so whenever the Barry and Pugin, who were going to design this building, were looking at it, they really believed Gothic is the best choice for England, because for some reason in their mind, Gothic was British, but it wasn't. It actually was French, and it made its way over with William the Conqueror, but whatever, all right? And they believed that all of these modern values were like the values that England believed in were being destroyed by the Industrial Revolution, and the government should have the morals of the past, which is really, you want to bring Gothic into that? Okay, fine, whatever you guys think, right? Pugin also said that the interior should be Gothic as well, not just the exterior, but the interior, as a way to remind the people who were serving in Parliament of what their job was. And it wasn't about these new modern ideas. It was more about the past values of, for example, the English Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta, which is, saying that nobody is above the law. Kind of a reminder of these pillars of English democracy, essentially. So you can see here on the Houses of Parliament, if you zoom in, you can see the Gothic style windows. You can see the verticality of even the statues and the Gothic decoration on the outside. You've got the pointed arch. You've got everything pointing upward to enhance that verticality of looking upwards on the building. It's very, very Gothic. And this is actually the interior. So there's the House of Lords and there's the House of Commons in Parliament. And right here, you're looking at the interior of the House of Lords, which is very much built like a Gothic choir, where the two sides face each other. And then you have the other people looking in. You have almost like the Gothic altar up there at the top for like the presiding officer, and all of these vertical elements to kind of remind people inside, to them, the Gothic time was a good time for England. It was when, they started to limit the power of the kings. It's where they created like I said, the Magna Carta, which said that all people are equal under the law, even the king. And it's this, pillars, basically, literal figural pillars, and then also the moral pillars of what their government is based on, because they are a democracy. Now, one of the really cool things that they want you to know for the 250 for the Houses of Parliament is Westminster Hall, all right? And Westminster Hall literally watched England become a democracy just in how this building, this particular hall was used. It was the biggest room in England. It was absolutely massive. And this hall, originally built, was so impressive and expansive because originally they thought they would have had to have 2 rows of columns, like a colonnade, to hold this ceiling up. But they have discovered through architectural investigation, this building always had a roof that was self-supported by this hammer beam roof, which I'm going to show you. And so because of that, you're talking about this massive, expansive hall where there's no columns diminishing the size of it. It was meant to be purely intimidating. This is where kings and queens would come and hold trials. It's where people would be sentenced to death. It's where people would come to see the king. Like, it was all about the king's power and his size and what this was about in terms of a monarchy. Today, it is completely changed because now this hall connects the 2 houses of parliament and basically, connects the 2 sides of the democracy that they are, because they do elect their prime minister. They have the 2 houses that work together to make legislation. So it's completely changed, but you can see how impressive this was at the time to have such a huge, massive room like this. So this is the Great Hall, or the Westminster Hall. And what you see here, these wooden built piers where it braces against the wall and then comes out and then braces off of that. These are called hammer beams because they're kind of hammered into the wall, and they supported that ceiling and the walls instead of columns doing it. So it's kind of like a Roman basilica of walking in and just being in complete awe of this building. And again, it used to be a place where the king would sit and hold trials and people would be sentenced to death, and it was about paying homage to a king. But now it literally connects the 2 sides of the British democracy. This is just another example of that hammer beam. You can see how it's hammered into the wall and then comes out and then supports the roof beams on top of it. And that's very much an English innovation. And this here is the central lobby. And you can see it's got that Gothic rib vaulting on the inside. It has all the patron saints of all of Great Britain, the statues that are there. It's got statues of former prime ministers that are in it, but it's a constant reminder of the fact that with all the patron saints of each of the people within Great Britain, each of the countries as part of it, that they are there working together as representatives. And it's got that Gothic perpendicular on the windows, the stained glass in the windows, and then of course you have the rib vaulting and fan vaulting on the ceiling holding up this entrance. So right from the start, when you walk into the central lobby, you're reminded of the unified purpose of this democracy, that it is all of these, territories and countries together. Now, I just think this is pretty cool that in Parliament and in the lobby, they used to have these grills that you can see here that were put over the window so that way women couldn't fully see and participate on what was going on within the government buildings. And then when British women got the right to vote, they took those down so that way it would signify that they have a face, they have a voice, they are part of this democracy as well. So I just think that's kind of cool. They put this here. The brass screens now in the windows of this hall once formed the grille fixed in the ladies' gallery of the House of Commons. They were removed on the 23rd of August, 1917, pursuant to the vote passed by the House on the 15th of August, 1917. Now, I just like to always show, because I am a tour guide at Belle Fountain Cemetery in St. Louis, and Belle Fountain was actually built in 1849, which is when the Romanticist movement was going on. So in the cemetery that I work at, there are a ton of revivals there just in the monuments that people have. Aside from tons of obelisks, this is actually a Gothic Revival mausoleum that only holds 2 people, and that's actually Adolphus Busch and Lily Anheuser. So this is actually the king of beers himself. This is his Gothic mausoleum. We also have in Belle Fountain tons of Egyptian references, and this is the Tate Mausoleum, which is in Belle Fountain. Excuse me, I'll go back to that, which you can see has the columns that have papyrus reeds up at the top. It's built in the shape of a mastaba, which is like a level of a pyramid, and then we have the Sphinx guardian figures there in the front, and then up here at the top, you'll see the circle, which is the sun Ra, and then the 3 levels of wings, which are good thoughts, good words, and good deeds that got you into the afterlife. So huge revival, even in America at the time. So another big thing that's going to happen during this time in the Romanticist era, because we are in the Industrial Revolution, is we have now found ways to mass produce images. We're mass producing everything else. So now with all of these inventions in copper and metals and experiments like that, they have figured out how to mass produce pictures, and photography starts to develop. And this huge debate started to arrive as to whether or not photographers were truly artists, because they weren't actually creating the scene, they were just capturing it. So that's going to be a really big part of the Romanticist movement. So they start out with photograms because they had photosensitive paper developed through chemical engineering that could copy an object when it was exposed to light. So like the light would shine through it, and I guess this is how it would create this image on it. So that got people thinking. And you get Louis Daguerre, and Daguerre created the daguerreotype, right? So he would take a copper plate with silver on it that would be exposed to light-sensitive chemicals that would capture the light and the dark. So very, very industrial in the metals and the chemicals that were used to do this. And Daguerre figured out how to take, and to take these things took forever. Like it could take anywhere from 1 minute to 20 minutes. That's why nobody is smiling in early photographs, because you had to sit for so long and wait for the chemicals to do their work. And he could create these daguerreotypes, which were one of a kind. There could not be made, I mean, unless you took the picture again, but you couldn't make duplicates of them. Like it was just one picture with very clear details and a very shiny surface. So this is actually, all right, still life in studio. So Daguerre took this picture, which is a daguerreotype. It is a individual image. It's very unique, that was taken with this ability. So it's a one-of-a-kind image on highly polished silver-plated sheet of copper, sensitized with iodine vapors in a large camera box. And there's also mercury and salt water. I'm not even going to pretend to understand how all that works, but all of these chemicals would activate to create capturing the light in this scene. And what he chose to do with the artist studio is to demonstrate that he could capture light and shadow with a photograph just by where he stood and how he posed the objects to highlight different things. So this is the artist studio, and it definitely does a good job of capturing different textures, fabrics, just by the way that he stood and captured the light on it and he posed the light. We can see that that's basket weaving, that's a sculpture. Up there in the top is a painting. And what he deliberately did was make a symbolic message that he is using a new medium to capture old mediums. So kind of saying like photography is now joining other art forms as a legitimate art form. So then later we get the ability to produce negatives, and a guy named William Talbot figured out how to mass produce an image using negatives, which you guys don't understand because you don't, unless you take photography, you take a picture digitally. We used to have to, I sound like one of those, in my day, we had to take a picture with a camera, take it to be developed using chemicals, and then you would get the negatives back. So if you wanted to reproduce the image, you could do that. All right, but these aren't really as sharp an image or as clear as a daguerreotype. So for the 250, what they wanted you to know was an artist named Nadar, which is actually his, or Nadar, I've heard it both ways. He is a French photographer. That's not actually his name. He took this as a pseudonym. And he was very inspired by the Romanticist and Realist movement. He's kind of a bridge in between. And he was kind of a mad scientist, is what they called him, in terms of how he took pictures. He was very big into satire and caricatures, but none of that really worked out for him very well. So he started to get his real fame by becoming a celebrity photographer. And they said they liked him so much because he could capture, by the way that he took the picture and posed them and put them in scenes, that he could truly capture who they were rather than just as an object. So he's known for taking photography above and below ground. He figured out how to set up artificial lighting in catacombs under France and take pictures down there. And he started to use a hot air balloon to take pictures from above. So he was trying to elevate, literally, photography to a new art form. So this is actually, the picture right here is a picture of a very famous mime in France at the time. And what he really wanted to do is make sure that people knew that photography was not just capturing an image, that the way that you took it, the way that you posed them, the lighting that you used, you could capture the psychological side of the person. You could capture who they are instead of just what they are. You could highlight different parts of them. You could get them candidly. You could, it's kind of like today when we go get senior pictures made or wedding pictures. Like my favorite pictures from my wedding aren't the ones that are posed and standing there as a wedding party. It's the candid ones that they caught of me and my husband looking at each other, or these moments where you could really see the love in the scene, or my newborn photos of my daughter, where it's not just me holding her as a baby, or my son, but they're taking pictures of me loving my son and highlighting, our faces together. And Nadar was the first person to do that this is not just an industrial production of an image, but you're trying to capture the psychological person of the photo in the photograph. So for example, this is Sarah Bernard, who was a famous actress at the time, and he wrapped her in this dark cloak, and so that he could really capture her face and her image, and having her look off to the side and capture kind of the mind of this artist who is an actress. Like, he factored in the props that he used and the poses and the lighting to really capture who the person is. So, for example, what he did with this one right here, this is Théophile Gautier, he used the light to really capture the mind and highlight the brain of this person and how intelligent they were. So he didn't like to use a lot of props because he thought that was gimmicky. He wanted to make these people feel comfortable and really express who they are to capture them, not just a picture of them. So this is actually a caricature done of Nadar. It is not by him, all right? It's actually done by somebody else who felt very threatened by him. And the title of it is Nadar Elevating Photography to the Level of Art. So it sounds like he's elevating photography to be a true art form. But in all actuality, it's really making fun of him quite a bit. So this is Nadar elevating photography to the height of art. And it really is, it's by an artist who does caricatures named Honoré Daumier. And he's doing it to literally make fun of Nadar as like this mad scientist who is so busy trying to get this perfect picture that he's almost falling out of the balloon and his hat is falling off. But he's trying to show that he doesn't want people to see this as an art form. He wants it to see that this is ridiculous and making fun of Nadar in what he's doing, because this really is going to start to kick off a debate over whether photography is actually art or not.